The most dangerous moment is not when a narcissist gets angry, but when they fully come to terms with the fact that you are not returning. At that point, their reaction is often not what people assume. There is not always begging, pleading, or loud emotional outbursts. Instead, what can emerge is something quieter, more controlled, and far more strategic. Once it truly lands for them that the separation is permanent, the first shock is the complete disappearance of their sense of control over you. This realization destabilizes them because it strips away the emotional hold they believed still existed. That internal shift can feel abrupt, even if it has been building slowly over time. It is the moment influence turns into absence, and that absence is exactly what becomes psychologically difficult for them to accept. In their inner experience, control is not just one part of a relationship. It is essentially the structure the relationship is built on. It is how they regulate emotion, maintain their identity, and protect themselves from feelings like emptiness or insecurity. As long as there is even a slight possibility that you might return, respond, or emotionally engage, they still experience a sense of leverage. Even small reactions keep the connection alive in their perception. But once you fully detach, that imagined access to you disappears. Losing that leverage creates a strong internal threat that is difficult for them to sit with. Much of their behavior depends on the belief that they can still affect how others think and feel about them. When that belief collapses, it feels like being shut out of your inner world completely. Unlike psychologically healthy people who can tolerate powerlessness even when it feels uncomfortable, this experience lands in a much more destabilizing way for a narcissistic structure. Powerlessness can bring up intense shame, emotional exposure, insecurity, and a sense of internal collapse. It also disrupts the superiority-based self-image they rely on to stay psychologically balanced. When you are able to leave and remain gone, it directly challenges their internal story that they are irreplaceable or uniquely significant. Your absence becomes proof that their influence was never as total as they believed. To defend against this, they often reshape the narrative in their own mind. They might minimize your value, dismiss your role, or convince themselves they were the one who chose to end things. These patterns are not always conscious deception. They are more like psychological defenses, protecting a fragile inner sense of self. This phase becomes especially intense because there is no external way for them to fix it. They cannot talk you back into the dynamic, no matter how they reframe the situation. Charm, pressure, or emotional triggering no longer work to pull you in. Without your engagement, they are left alone with an internal emotional state that is harder and harder to regulate. This often shows up as increased emotional rigidity, distance, or quiet resentment. In some cases, it can also turn into indirect hostility or subtle behaviors aimed at regaining a sense of superiority. Ultimately, it is the mind attempting to restore control in a situation where control no longer exists. The more permanent your absence becomes, the more they are forced to confront a reality they can no longer reshape. When a narcissist comes to understand that you are gone for good, they often avoid direct contact because it feels too exposing. Instead, they may move into a quieter pattern that looks like distant observation. This is not simple curiosity or emotional missing in a healthy sense. It is more about managing anxiety while still trying to feel some sense of control over your life. Reaching out would force them to acknowledge your independence, and that independence is exactly what threatens their sense of stability. Watching from a distance feels safer because it gives them information without risking rejection. This can show up as repeatedly checking your online presence, watching how others interact with you, or gathering updates through mutual contacts. The behavior may be subtle or persistent, but the underlying focus is usually the same. They are tracking your emotional state, comparing it to their expectations, and reacting internally to what they see. But what often disturbs them most is not just your presence online, but evidence that you are doing well without them. If you appear stable, content, or emotionally grounded, it directly challenges the internal story they held about your dependence on them. That contradiction creates discomfort because it weakens the belief that they were essential to your well-being. At the same time, this distant monitoring can also become a way for them to look for openings. Any sign of emotional vulnerability, change, or instability may be interpreted as a possible entry point back into your life. This is why contact sometimes appears unexpectedly long after separation, often when things seem completely over. Alongside this, there can be a subtle attempt to maintain psychological presence while avoiding direct engagement, as if staying connected without accountability. Over time, this can shift into image management, where the focus becomes controlling how the story is understood by others. Events may be reframed, responsibility softened, and your role distorted, not always out of conscious intent, but as a way to protect a fragile self-image from shame or blame. Image repair also plays another key role for them. It reinforces the feeling that they still matter socially and can influence how others see them. By shaping the story, they are not just explaining events. They are trying to guide emotional reactions in their favor. Support, sympathy, agreement, and validation from friends, relatives, or colleagues can start to replace the emotional regulation that the relationship once provided. Each time someone agrees with their version of events, it strengthens their sense of being right, misunderstood, or unfairly treated. This outside validation becomes a kind of emotional support system, especially when their internal stability feels weak. The more threatened they feel inside, the more they may rely on this external reinforcement to steady themselves, even if only temporarily. What is often misunderstood is how much this dynamic intensifies when you stay silent. When you do not respond, defend yourself, or constantly correct distortions, you remove the direct pushback they rely on to stay engaged in the narrative. In that silence, they are free to expand their version of events without interruption. This can feel deeply unfair from your perspective, especially when you know your experience is being misrepresented. But in their interpretation, your silence is rarely seen as restraint or emotional maturity. Instead, it can be taken as absence of resistance, which they unconsciously read as space to reinforce their own version of reality. The less contradiction they face, the more certain they may become in the story they are building, even if it is heavily distorted. This does not reflect inner strength in the way it might appear on the surface. Underneath it is often a fragile structure held together by control, external validation, and avoidance of shame. The more permanent your departure becomes, the more cracks appear in that structure. Your absence removes not only the relationship, but also the psychological mirror that once supported their self-image. That is why the realization that you are truly gone can feel so destabilizing. It is not just loss of a person, but loss of influence, control, and identity reinforcement. Even if they never openly acknowledge it, their behavior often reflects an ongoing attempt to manage that internal disruption through surveillance, narrative control, and subtle efforts to regain relevance in your world. In some cases, this later shifts into delayed attempts to reconnect, often called delayed hoovering. These usually do not happen immediately, because an early attempt risks rejection, which would intensify the original wound. Time is used strategically to reduce perceived risk and rebuild confidence in approaching again. From their perspective, distance can soften emotional boundaries and make re-entry more possible. These attempts are rarely direct or forceful at first. Instead, they may come in the form of neutral messages, nostalgic references, vague apologies, or emotionally loaded check-ins that avoid full accountability. What is being tested is not genuine reconciliation, but access. Even a small response can be interpreted as evidence that the connection is not fully closed, which is often all that is needed for them to believe the door is still partially open. Delayed hoovering also gives them space to reconstruct the story in their own mind. With enough distance, the emotional weight of the breakup can fade enough for them to reshape what happened into something easier to live with. The conflict may be reinterpreted as something mutual, exaggerated, misunderstood, or already resolved simply because time has passed. This mental revision lowers the emotional cost of reaching out again. In that updated version of events, They are no longer the person who caused harm or instability. Instead, they become someone checking in, being kind, offering closure, or reconnecting in a positive way. That shift is important because it protects their self-image while also subtly placing emotional responsibility onto you. Now you are positioned as the one who has to decide whether to be forgiving, understanding, or emotionally open, while their role is framed as harmless or even generous. What makes this pattern particularly destabilizing is that it often appears at moments when you are actually doing better. When your life has become more stable, your emotional distance stronger, and your focus no longer centered on them, it can trigger a reaction. Your progress can be experienced less as something positive and more as a loss of relevance in your internal world. In that sense, the outreach is not always about missing you in an emotional or relational way. It can be more about discomfort with no longer holding significance in your life. The timing is rarely accidental. It often shows up when your independence feels solid and your healing is becoming visible from the outside. At that point, the interaction is less about rebuilding something genuine and more about testing whether access or importance can still be reestablished in any form. When the realization settles that you are not returning, a deeper psychological process often begins, rewriting the past. The original version of events becomes too emotionally uncomfortable to hold on to because it conflicts with the self-image they need to maintain. They are forced to reconcile two things that do not easily coexist: the idea that they are competent, justified, or in control, and the reality that the relationship ended in a way that may reflect harm or failure on their part. Since full acceptance would require accountability, and accountability often triggers intense internal shame, the mind adjusts instead. Memory becomes selective and reshaped over time. In this revised internal narrative, painful moments are softened or reinterpreted. Your boundaries may be reframed as attacks, your reactions as overreactions, and their behavior as reasonable responses to your flaws. Over time, this edited version can feel more real to them than what actually happened. This is why they can sometimes speak about the past with strong confidence or moral certainty, even when it contradicts your lived experience. That certainty is not necessarily deliberate deception. It is often the result of a mind protecting itself from psychological discomfort. The rewritten story also serves a social function. It can be used to gain sympathy, justify their actions, and maintain an image of being misunderstood or unfairly treated, even long after the relationship has ended. When someone fully accepts that a relationship is over and there is no return, what follows is often less about the other person and more about internal stability. If their sense of self was strongly tied to influence, validation, or emotional impact, the absence of that connection can feel disorienting. In that state, the mind tends to look for ways to reduce discomfort rather than sit with uncertainty. One of the most common ways this happens is through gradual reinterpretation of the past. It is not usually a single decision where everything is rewritten at once. It is more subtle, like repeated small adjustments over time that make the story easier to carry emotionally. What gets adjusted is often responsibility and emotional meaning. Moments that once felt charged may be mentally softened so they no longer trigger discomfort. Situations where they felt challenged may be reframed in a way that restores a sense of being justified or reasonable. This kind of internal editing is less about accuracy and more about emotional survival. The human mind, in general, prefers a coherent identity over a fully detailed but emotionally painful truth. So, when there is a conflict between self-image and lived experience, self-image often wins in some form, even if it means reshaping memory slightly. This is also where distance plays a powerful role. As time passes, emotional intensity naturally decreases, and that reduction makes reinterpretation easier. Something that once felt like a sharp rupture can start to feel like a phase or a misunderstanding simply because it is no longer emotionally active. That fading intensity can create the impression that what happened was not as significant as it once felt, even if nothing has actually changed about the facts. In that softened emotional space, The mind becomes more flexible with meaning, especially if holding the original version of events creates discomfort or shame. At the same time, there is often a parallel process of preserving self-worth. People generally need to maintain a sense that they are fundamentally okay, competent, or justified in their actions. When a relationship ends in a way that threatens that sense, especially if there is rejection or loss involved, the mind may unconsciously shift responsibility outward to protect inner stability. This does not always happen in a fully intentional or calculated way. It can feel completely natural from the inside, almost like this is how it really was, rather than this is how I am choosing to see it. That certainty can grow stronger the more the alternative version of events feels emotionally threatening. What makes this especially complex is that memory is not a fixed recording. It is reconstructive, meaning it can be influenced by current emotions, identity needs, and social feedback. If a person receives validation from others about their version of events, that reinforcement can strengthen the revised narrative even further. Over time, repetition and reinforcement can make the reinterpretation feel indistinguishable from original memory. That is part of why people can become very convinced of their own account, even when it differs significantly from how the other person experienced the same relationship. This process can also affect future behavior. If someone has reframed a past relationship in a way that removes personal responsibility, it becomes easier for them to re-enter similar dynamics without feeling the need for deep reflection. The past is no longer a source of accountability, but a source of justification. In that sense, rewriting history is not only about the past itself, but also about preserving how they move forward without internal conflict. For the person on the other side, this can feel confusing or invalidating, especially when they remember things very differently. It can create a sense of being erased or misunderstood. But what is often happening is not a shared agreement on truth, but two separate internal systems trying to preserve coherence in different ways. One prioritizes emotional safety through reinterpretation, while the other prioritizes emotional clarity through memory consistency. Those two needs do not always align, which is why the gap between experiences can feel so wide. When that gap in perspective continues, it can create something that feels like two completely different versions of the same relationship existing in parallel. One version becomes emotionally simplified, where responsibility is distributed in a way that feels manageable internally. The other version stays closer to lived experience, including the emotional complexity, the inconsistencies, and the impact certain behaviors actually had. Neither of these perspectives forms in a vacuum. They are shaped by what each person needs in order to feel psychologically stable after the connection ends. In the version shaped by self-protection, emotional discomfort tends to get reduced by removing or softening anything that threatens self-image. That can include minimizing harm caused, reframing reactions as justified responses, or focusing heavily on the idea that the other person was difficult, unstable, or incompatible. This allows the person to feel internally consistent again, even if the emotional logic is built on selective interpretation. Over time, repetition of that internal story can make it feel increasingly natural, as if it was always the most accurate version of events. On the other side, the person who experienced the relationship more directly often carries a different kind of residue. Their memory is usually tied not just to facts, but to emotional impact, timing, tone, and lived experience. Because of that, the ending doesn't always get simplified in the same way. It can remain layered, containing both positive moments and confusing or painful ones that don't easily resolve into a single, clean narrative. That lack of simplicity can feel heavy, but it is often closer to how human connection actually unfolds when it is complex and inconsistent. This difference in processing can make any later interaction feel disorienting. When one person speaks from a revised, emotionally filtered narrative and the other still holds a more detailed emotional memory, even basic communication can feel misaligned. What one person says may sound confident and final, while the other hears distortion or omission. That mismatch is often where confusion, doubt, or emotional reactivation comes from, because it creates the sense that reality itself is no longer shared. Over time, if no correction or mutual reflection happens, both narratives tend to solidify in separate directions. The internal story that protects self-image becomes more fixed through repetition and reinforcement, while the other person's understanding becomes more anchored in personal meaning and emotional integration. This is why revisiting the past rarely produces clarity unless both sides are willing to tolerate discomfort and complexity at the same time, which is uncommon when the relationship ended with emotional injury or unresolved tension. Eventually, what remains is not a single agreed-upon truth, but two internally coherent realities that serve different psychological purposes. One preserves identity stability by reducing blame and emotional conflict, while the other preserves emotional authenticity by holding on to experience as it was felt. The distance between those two realities is often what makes closure feel incomplete, even long after direct contact has ended. As this separation between narratives deepens, another layer often develops. Emotional distance gets replaced with symbolic presence. Even when there is no contact, the other person can still occupy mental space, not as a real-time relationship, but as a reference point the mind returns to when trying to make sense of the past. This doesn't necessarily mean longing or attachment in a direct sense. It can simply be the mind trying to organize unfinished emotional material, especially when the ending felt incomplete or internally inconsistent. In this stage, the past relationship can become less about the person and more about unresolved meaning. Questions like what it really was, who was responsible for what, and how things should be interpreted can linger long after the practical connection is gone. When those questions don't settle naturally, the mind often keeps revisiting the story in fragments, trying different interpretations until something feels internally acceptable. This process can repeat quietly in the background, especially during moments of stress, loneliness, or transition. At the same time, emotional memory doesn't behave like a fixed archive. It can shift depending on current emotional needs. When someone feels confident and stable, the past may feel distant and less emotionally charged. When they feel uncertain or vulnerable, the same memories can become more vivid or significant again. This fluctuation can create the impression that the past is reactivating, when in reality, it is the present emotional state changing how the past is being accessed and interpreted. For the person who has reframed the relationship more defensively, these fluctuations can also influence behavior. If their current self-image feels threatened or challenged, the past may be selectively revisited in a way that reinforces stability. That can include focusing more on justifications, highlighting perceived wrongs, or reinforcing the idea that they acted reasonably under the circumstances. This is not always a conscious effort to distort. It is often an automatic return to whatever version of the story maintains emotional balance at that moment. Meanwhile, the other person may experience a different pattern, where clarity comes and goes in waves. At times, the ending may feel settled and understood. At other times, new interpretations emerge as more emotional distance allows for different angles of reflection. This can create a sense of ongoing internal processing rather than a fixed conclusion. It is not necessarily a sign of confusion, but rather a reflection of how complex emotional bonds take time to fully integrate. Eventually, what often remains is not a desire to return to the relationship, but a recognition that the experience cannot be reduced to a single simple explanation. The mind may stop trying to resolve it in a final way and instead hold it as something that happened, shaped both people differently, and no longer needs active engagement to exist. This is often where emotional closure begins to form, not as a clear ending, but as a gradual reduction in the need to keep reconstructing the story. Over time, when the need to repeatedly revisit the story starts to fade, something quieter often takes its place: acceptance without resolution. This doesn't mean full understanding has been reached or that every question has been answered. It simply means the mind stops feeling compelled to keep reorganizing the experience into something final or perfectly coherent. The emotional system begins to settle even if the intellectual questions are still there in the background. In many cases, this shift happens gradually through detachment rather than insight. The emotional charge linked to the memories weakens, not because the memories disappear, but because they stop triggering the same internal response. What once felt urgent or consuming begins to feel more distant, like something that belongs to another version of life. This distance is not forced. It develops naturally as attention and emotional energy get redirected toward present experiences. At this stage, the past can still be remembered, but it no longer dominates interpretation of the present. Instead of being something the mind tries to solve, it becomes something it can simply observe. The intensity of meaning starts to reduce, and with that reduction comes a different kind of clarity, one that is less about defining who was right or wrong, and more about recognizing that the experience had its own internal logic at the time it was happening. For the person who once felt the need to reconstruct or defend their version of events, there is often a softening in that impulse. The emotional necessity to justify or correct diminishes because the identity is no longer as tightly bound to the outcome of that specific story. What replaces it is a broader sense of continuity, where the relationship is seen as one part of a larger personal timeline, rather than a defining or central event. This doesn't erase the impact of what happened. It simply changes its function in memory. Instead of being a source of ongoing emotional tension, it becomes part of lived experience that has already contributed to growth, understanding, or awareness in ways that don't require constant re-examination. The mind no longer needs to keep negotiating with the past in order to feel stable in the present. Eventually, what remains is not closure in the dramatic sense, but quiet integration. The story still exists, but it no longer demands attention. It no longer pulls the same emotional weight. And in that reduction of intensity, space opens up for new experiences to be felt without being filtered through the need to resolve what came before.